Friday's podcast. Here you listen to original science fiction stories infused with truth. I'm your host, Allie Anderson, and I'll be reading stories I have written myself. Episodes will be released every Friday. Today's episode is called Suspicious Suspicions, Part 1. Sage Waters grinned as she reached across the metal table in her dad's workshop. Her dad was an engineer for a company called Bits and Pieces Tech, so he often got to work with many of their products hands-on. Bits and Pieces treated their employees well, which is why her dad got his own workshop in the back of the main building. "What is it, Sage?" Kathryn Morse, one of Sage's new friends, said as she grabbed the small screwdriver that Sage was handing her. "I think I just put together my first robot." Sage gestured to the small device in front of her. It was a lazy Friday afternoon, and her dad had brought Sage and her friends to his workshop. He had shown them some ideas for gadgets and given them a small assortment of parts to build robots and a computer to program them with. So far, no one seemed to be bothered by the girls while they were quietly working and giggling in the garage-like room. Patty Hart, Sage's other new friend, nodded in her usual matter-of-fact manner. "I remember when I first built my robot 4 years ago. Looking back now, it probably wasn't that great, but I sure was proud of her." Kathryn raised an eyebrow. "Are you talking about Rosie?" she asked. Patty nodded. "Yes, she has changed a lot over the years." She turned to Sage. "Rosie the robot is our housemaid bot. Everyone in Scandium has a manufactured one by Bits and Pieces, but Rosie is one I made myself." "Wow, that's cool," Sage said. Before Sage's family had moved to Scandium, Bits and Pieces Tech was a small company compared to many of the other large manufacturers she'd seen. But now that Bits and Pieces moved her dad to their home base, Sage really saw the impact the company made on the community. The robots were everywhere, and did so many things for the citizens of Scandium. Kathryn came over to Sage's spot at the table. "What does yours do, Sage?" "Watch this." Sage pushed a button on the top of the small, box-like robot. As music blared from the tiny robot, it rolled around the table. Patty laughed. "It dances?" Sage nodded. "Yeah, did either of you get the chance to finish your projects?" Kathryn shook her head. "No, I think I made mine a little too sophisticated. It's supposed to be able to cook waffles and pancakes at the same time, but I'm having trouble getting it to work. I think I'll just take it apart so Mr. Waters can use the parts." "You shouldn't give up on it so easily." Sage pushed the stop button on her robot. "Just because it's hard doesn't mean you can't do it." Kathryn shrugged. "I guess." But she didn't touch the parts in front of her. Sage looked over at Patty's station. "What are you working on, Patty?" "This is an add-on to one of my new inventions." Patty held up a small remote. "What does your new invention do?" Kathryn walked over to her station and began taking apart her gizmo. "You know those universal remotes that you can buy and sync to nearly any television or console? That's basically what this is, except it controls pretty much all devices. It can also automatically hook up to any robot." Patty set the remote down. "The real thing is back at home, but this is the portable one that hooks up to the main one." "That's cool." Sage pointed to her robot. "Can you control my mini robot?" Patty shook her head. "Not until I can manually program this one to the one at home." At that moment, Sage's dad walked into the room. "It's time to go, girls. Kathryn, your Uncle Paul is ready to drop you off at home. Patty, Sage and I will drop you off at home, at your house." Kathryn nodded, smiling. Her uncle worked for Bits and Pieces Tech like her Sage's dad. "Okay, thank you, Mr. Waters," then she turned to Sage and Patty. "I'll see you both on Monday." Patty waved at Kathryn from her spot across the room. "Bye, Kathryn. See you Monday." Sage smiled. "See you, Kathryn." The next morning, Sage woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing. It was a group text from Patty and Kathryn. Sage sat up and turned her lamp on so she could see a little better. It seemed like Patty was upset about something and Kathryn was trying to calm her down. Sage typed her own message to them. "What's going on? Is everyone okay?" She waited a moment, then a response came from Patty. "You know that invention I was talking about yesterday? It's gone now, and I can't find it anywhere." "What?" Sage said aloud, forgetting that they couldn't hear her. She typed it in her phone. "What? Couldn't you have put it somewhere and forgotten about it?" Kathryn chimed in. "That's what I've been trying to say, but Patty said she doesn't think so." Patty seemed to be typing for a long time, then a message came through. "I think someone stole it. When I went in the garage this morning, where I keep all my inventions, it was a mess in there. I'm usually very tidy in the garage, and everything was so disorganized." Sage raised her eyebrows. Could someone have really stolen Patty's invention? She typed a quick message. Maybe your parents were in there looking for something and it got lost? There was nothing from the group text for a couple minutes. Finally, she received a message from Patty. I don't think it was them. Can both of you come over soon? I'd like some help investigating. Sage typed her response. I need to ask my parents first, but I'm sure it'll be okay. Kathryn responded as quickly as Sage. I'll be there as soon as I can. As soon as Sage got the chance, she asked her parents if she could go over to Patty's house, which is just a couple blocks away. Once she got their permission, she grabbed her bicycle and headed over to Patty's house. Patty opened the door almost immediately after Sage rang the doorbell. She smiled, but it wasn't the bright, usual, genuine smile that she usually gave. Hi, Sage. Come in. Sage stepped inside, smiling a greeting at Kathryn, who was already standing in the front hallway. A squatty robot about 3 feet tall rolled over to them. Hello, Patty's friends. May I accommodate you with some refreshments? Sage glanced at Patty, who smiled proudly at the robot. Sage turned to the little robot. She shook her head. No, thank you. Kathryn smiled at the robot. Hi, Rosie. Not at the moment, but thank you. She turned to Patty. Did you add a new hospitality program to Rosie? She said. Patty shrugged. Just a small one. Now come on, let me show you what I found in the garage this morning. She gestured for Kathryn and Sage to follow her. Patty opened the door to what Sage guessed was the garage and led them inside. Wow, it is a mess in here, isn't it? Kathryn said as she surveyed the room. Sage looked around. Most people who had housemaid bots used their garages as the robot's storage space. She saw a charging spot for Rosie to one side of the room, but on the other there was a large workbench and several gadgets and gizmos spread across it. There was an upturned toolbox next to the workbench and a handful of tools spilling out of it. Sage hadn't known Patty very long, so she didn't know if this was normal or not. Judging by Kathryn's and Patty's reactions, this must have been a far cry from Patty's normal workspace. Patty walked closer to the workbench and began straightening the gadgets and putting them away in the storage bin below it. Why would someone want one of your inventions? Kathryn came over and started picking up the tools. Not wanting to be left out, Sage came over and helped Kathryn. Patty paused what she was doing for a moment. Maybe they'd want to sell it? It's the kind of device that can cause a lot of issues if it got in the wrong hands. The main reason I made it was to connect all my own gadgets. Have you seen all these devices in here? I keep losing all the individual controls for them, so I thought it'd be nice to simplify things and make one that can control all of them at once. Did you tell anyone other than us about the device? Kathryn said as she stood up once they finished putting all the tools away. You two and my parents are the only ones who know about it. Patty walked over to the lawn chair beside the workbench that also seemed to have been knocked over. And the only time I've ever talked about it outside my own house was at Bits and Pieces the other day. Did you report this to the police? Sage asked. We did. There's not enough evidence for them to go anywhere with it. They thought I was making it up. Patty set the chair upright. Sage peered around the room as if evidence would just jump out at her. What kind of evidence were they looking for? The usual stuff, fingerprints, any form of DNA, loose garment, stuff like that. Patty opened one of the drawers below her workbench and pulled out a gadget the size of her hand. She grabbed a tool from her toolbox and screwed a piece of it off. Sage frowned. And they didn't find even a single fingerprint? They found absolutely nothing. Kathryn exchanged a look with Sage, raising her eyebrows. How is it possible to not leave any fingerprints anywhere? Sage began pacing the room as she thought. They could wear gloves. Patty screwed the part back onto her gadget and set the screwdriver down. Sage, any smart burglar will have covered all the bases. Yes, but what if it wasn't a normal burglar? What if it was a robot? Sage looked at Kathryn. And if the police couldn't find any evidence that a human was there, then a robot would make a burglary like this much easier. Kathryn grinned. Good idea, Sage. Patty put the gadget down beside the screwdriver. But if it was a robot, it would be a lot harder to find than a human. I appreciate both of you coming over, but I'm afraid it's a dead end at this point. We can't give up so easily. Sage put a hand on her hip. She turned to Kathryn. Can we? Kathryn looked from Sage to Patty. I don't know. A robot is pretty hard to track down. Maybe we should think about it for a while. Patty nodded. I'm bummed about losing my device, but it's not worth a bunch of fuss like this. I'm sorry I overreacted this morning and made you two come over. She smiled, but it was the same one that Sage saw when she first walked in the door. Sage couldn't believe it. It felt like Kathryn and Patty were just letting these burglars walk all over them without much of a fight. There had to be something that could be done. but it was Patty's device and not Sage's. Sage sighed. All right, but I'm going to keep an eye and ear out for your gadget, Patty. Patty's smile became a little more genuine. Thanks, Sage. For the next couple days, Sage tried hard to think of ways they could find the burglar. She came up with several ideas for gadgets that Patty could make to catch him and presented them to Patty during lunch on Monday. What if you made surveillance systems that tracks any movement, so that anything that comes in your garage gets caught on videotape? Sage showed Patty a small drawing that she'd made in her notebook. Patty smiled. That's a good idea, but I don't think it would work now that the burglar is gone and likely won't be back. What if we set a trap for him? Sage flipped to a fresh page in her notebook and began scribbling the idea down. We could talk all day long about how the device was taken was actually the wrong device, and not the universal robot remote. Kathryn peered over Sage's shoulder as she opened her lunch sack. I'm pretty sure the burglar knows he has the right one. But wouldn't all our devices be controlled already? Sage raised her eyebrows. She stopped writing to look at Patty and Kathryn. Patty laughed. I appreciate your enthusiasm, Sage, but I think whoever took it is probably using it for a prank or something, and not for a world domination plan. If you say so. Sage closed her notebook and began eating her own lunch. I just think we should continue investigating. It feels like we're giving up. I know, but I don't want to let it ruin my week. Patty tossed a couple cookies in front of Sage and Kathryn. Rosie made these. She made me bring them to school so I could have them for lunch today. With that robot around, my mom isn't allowed to cook or bake hardly anything anymore. I think I need to tone down the hospitality program a bit. Kathryn laughed. Sage smiled but couldn't stop thinking about how they could catch the person or robot who took Patty's remote. That afternoon after school, Kathryn invited Patty and Sage over to her house to play some board games. Kathryn's uncle, Paul Morris, was also there talking with Kathryn's dad downstairs. He waved when he saw the girls. It's the Tech Trio! He laughed. Hey, Bits and Pieces Tech is releasing a new robot this week. I was wondering if you girls would want to take a look at it. Sage exchanged an excited look with Patty and Kathryn. Yes, we would, Uncle Paul. Kathryn smiled politely. Mr. Morris pulled out his phone and began fiddling with it. Finally, he showed a video to the girls. Sage gasped at the same time Kathryn and Patty did. The robot was dancing and playing music just like the one Sage made on Friday. Mr. Morris frowned and exchanged a look with Kathryn's dad, who shrugged. What's the matter? Sage, is that your robot? Patty looked at Sage with wide eyes. Sage nodded. It looks just like it. Kathryn shook her head, appearing to look just as shocked as Sage. She looked at Sage and Patty, then turned to her dad and uncle. The shocked expression melted away to something more diplomatic. Thank you for showing us this, Uncle Paul. We just thought it looked like something Sage made, and it surprised us. She laughed like it was a silly mistake. Come on, Sage and Patty, let's go play some games in my room. Sage followed Kathryn, still not sure what to think of what they had just seen. With a glance at Patty, Sage could tell she was thinking about something. As soon as they entered Kathryn's room, Kathryn shut the door. Patty turned to Sage. Did you tell anyone about your robot? Sage shrugged. Just my parents. The idea was all mine, I promise. Patty nodded. I know. I wonder... She waved it off. Never mind. Kathryn raised her eyebrows. What is it? It's just that it seems a little odd that the only time we ever talk about these gadgets is at Bits and Pieces, and then something happens to them. Don't you think? Patty walked over to Kathryn's bed and sat down. She stood up again. You're right. Sage leaned against the door. Do you think Bits and Pieces Tech is behind all this? Patty nodded again. I do, but this is going to take some elbow grease. Sage, it looks like you were right all along. We shouldn't have given up on this, even though it seemed difficult. It's time we actually do something instead of talking about it. Kathryn took a deep breath. Like what? To be continued. Thank you so much for listening to the third episode in the Sci-Fi Fridays podcast. You can find the written version of this episode and comment on this week's question of the day at allieanderson.com/sci-fi-fridays-suspicions-part 1. Or you can click the link in the description. Now for today's question of the day. If Patty built a brother for Rosie the robot, what kinds of things do you think he could do? I cannot wait to hear from you. Until next Friday, this is Allie Anderson signing off.